We have seen how to log in using Authenticator code from Authenticator apps. Now, let's add the option for users to be able to use recovery codes, which will come in handy when users are unable to reach their Authenticator apps. In this lesson, we will be covering generating two-factor recovery codes, and we will be doing that at the point of enabling two-factor authentication. First, let's head over to the two-factor authenticator service class, which is where we are going to add the logic for generating the recovery codes. We are going to add a public method, which will be responsible for generating the recovery codes. The method is going to return an array of strings. The recovery codes will be a set of 8 random strings. We are going to start by defining a variable that will hold the recovery codes. So I'm going to call the variable recovery codes. The variable is going to be a type of array of strings, and we are going to initialize it to be an empty array. Then we are going to have a for loop. Let index equals 0 and index less than 8. Like I said, the recovery codes will be a set of 8 random strings. Of course, we can modify this however we like, but for this course, I'm going to keep it at 8. Then index plus plus. To generate the actual random string, we are going to be using the Adonis string helper. So let's import it. Then we are going to create a new method, which will be responsible for generating the random string, and it's going to be a private method. Method is going to return a string. And inside the method, we are going to use the string helper and call the generate random method. And the size of the string is going to be 10. Now we can make use of the method. First, let's define a variable that will hold the recovery code. Then we can call the generate random string method. We're going to generate another random string. And we're going to separate the two of them with an hyphen. We need to wrap this inside a string literal. We now have the recovery code. So what we need to do next is push it to the array. Then finally, we can simply return the array. Now we can make use of this method inside the two-factor authentication controller at the point of enabling two-factor authentication, which is here. So we're going to set the two-factor recovery codes using the method we just created. Now, when users enable two-factor authentication, recovery codes will be automatically generated for them. Before we try this out in the browser, I'm going to make some modification to the views. First, we're going to move this view inside the two-factor auth directory and rename it to create. Then let's update its reference here also. Then we are going to create a new view for showing the recovery codes. I'm going to duplicate this view. And this will be recovery codes. The title of this page will be two-factor recovery codes. And for the contents, I'm going to get rid of all this and simply display a list of the recovery codes. Let's add some classes. First, I'm going to set the background to be gray 50, then the text to gray 500, and the font to be medium. I'll give it a padding of 4 and make it rounded, and set the text to be small. On large screens, we want the code to be presented in 2 columns, but on small screens, we want it to be 1 column. Then lastly, a vertical space around each item. Let's head over to the user model to add a way to easily retrieve the recovery codes. Just as we did here, we're going to create another getter, which we will call recovery codes. And it's going to return an array of strings. So return these two-factor recovery codes. And if the recovery code has not been set, that is if the user is yet to enable two-factor authentication, we are simply going to return an empty array. So now we can loop through the recovery codes. Recovery code in auth user recovery codes. And this will be recovery code. Next, let's update the settings page. Since we now have a way of knowing whether or not a user has enabled two-factor authentication, we are going to modify this accordingly. So first, we are going to have an if check. So if auth user has enabled two-factor authentication, then we are going to say two-factor authentication is enabled in your account. Let's add some styling to the paragraph. So, but if the user is yet to enable two-factor authentication, that is when we want to display this link to enable two-factor authentication. In addition to this, we want to also display the option to see their recovery codes. I'm going to make this flex and give it an even space. And I'm going to duplicate this. And this is going to be recovery codes. And this will point to a show method on a new controller, which will be two-factor recovery code controller, which we are going to create shortly. Node is make controller. Let's add the show method. And the method is simply going to render the recovery codes view, which is inside settings / two-factor auth / recovery codes. Before we forget, let's define the routes for this. I'm going to call this recovery codes. Let's check out what we have so far in the browser. Remember, I have already enabled two-factor authentication for this account. That's why we are seeing this. And if I click to view the recovery codes, it should be empty because as at when I enabled two-factor authentication for this account, we've not implemented recovery codes. And since we don't have a way to disable two-factor authentication yet, I'm going to do it manually by heading to the database and setting the values to null. If I refresh, we should see the option to enable two-factor authentication. So I'm going to enable two-factor authentication for this account again. Now we should be able to see the recovery codes, and sure we do. Ideally, we are expected to save or download the recovery codes in a safe place.